A few weeks ago, a couple came to my booth when I was selling plants and said, "We can't grow anything. We live near the beach. We're in this horrible, terrible sand. We can't grow anything in sand."
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
Super high drainage, and then suddenly, it dries out and it's like the Sahara and it blows all over and it doesn't hold any organic matter and it's absolutely terrible, and you just go, "I can't grow anything in sand. It's not gonna work at all." Do you see this? This is a consumer society that's gone awry. Some turtle's gonna stick this in its nose. You ready?
Go.
Today I'm gonna share with you a few tips for gardening in sand. Just like this. This is the kind of sand I grew up with in my backyard down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And you think that, no, you can't garden in this stuff. You need that black, loamy soil, or you're gonna have to get raised beds or containers or something like that. That's not true. You can totally garden in sand just like this. A few months ago, a Florida gardener named Jim wrote and said, "When I lived in Niceville, Florida, mid-1980s, I went to the local fisherman's co-op and sometimes to Destin Harbor to meet the returning boats. Got plenty of fish bones and guts for my garden. I took all my neighbors' live oak leaves that I could find, at least 100 bags each year, and put them into foot-deep trenches mixed with the fish residues. Covered with about 6 inches of the 99% pure sand, and planted my garden. No rotten fish smell. The first year was so-so as far as crops, but in the next 3 years, I was the talk of the town. The city administrator even came to see my garden. Based on my results, the Twin Cities of Niceville and Valparaiso launched a composting center and offered back free composted mulch to residents at no charge, saving the towns tens of thousands of dollars each year and landfill fees. Oak leaves, carbon. Fish guts, nitrogen. Composting right underneath the sand. And it worked for Jim, and it can work for you as well. A couple of years ago, I conducted an experiment. We were living on a rental property and there was a pile of construction sand that had been dropped some years before and had kind of spread out. I was able to borrow a tractor, and I took that construction sand and I made mounds with it. Just mounds that we could plant into, so kind of raised beds. Before I piled the sand into those mounds, I took manure pies right from the field, both fresh and dried ones. Went out to the cow field, got manure pies, lined them up in a row, and then mounded sand on top of them. And then on top of that sand, just pure sand, I planted some cassava cuttings, some yams, and some sweet potatoes. They got off to a start with some water, and then they greened up and they grew and they grew and they did well with just sand and manure. This eggplant right here is growing on top of some so-so sand. Right here you can see the grass that is growing in our sand, and then we just threw compost down and threw down a layer of cardboard and piled up wood chips on top of the cardboard and planted these eggplants right through it. And this eggplant is happy. Even though its roots are in mostly sand, there's enough organic matter and compost around it that it's doing all right. This sort of lasagna gardening technique of layering materials up right on top of the ground works excellently, particularly in sand. I have a food forest down in South Florida that we planted about 13 years ago. And in that food forest, the way we started it was we put some trees in the ground and then we put cardboard down over the weeds, and we got all of the waste material we could get from our neighbors' yard waste bins and just dumped it in a big pile. We're talking 2 to 3 feet tall with little pockets in it around the trees so they weren't completely covered in the mounds. We just mounded organic matter up on top of the soil, and we've continued to chop and drop and chop and drop different plants on top of that to keep that forest floor layer going. And even now, when I go down there and dig in the ground, you can see the difference between the sand that is in the pathways and the sand that is in that system. Just perpetually having materials dropped on top of it, it looks like rich, black, beautiful compost. because it is. Right here, this is even more redneck. This is so simple. We had some wood chips and some rotten chicken and some rough material, and we just piled it right on top of the ground and put pumpkin seeds in it. This pumpkin hill is just a mound of rough composted stuff thrown on top of the ground. There's peanut shells and all kinds of junk in here. You can also do this by digging a pit right in the sand, putting some nitrogenous material in it like a fish or a dead chicken or roadkill or fresh manure or whatever you want, planting over the top of it. In this case, we just dumped it right on top of the ground, put some seeds in it, and these pumpkins are ready to run. A lot of crops do quite well directly in the sand. This morning, we planted these sweet potatoes down the center here. They're gonna act as a ground cover underneath these yams that are climbing here. And then I planted some kiwi and some loofahs and some velvet beans and some other things on these other trellises. But these sweet potatoes will make nice, beautiful roots, and they expand very well in the sand. And we get a lot of sweet potatoes out of the sand. If you have sandy soil, sweet potatoes do excellently. Carrots will also do well, turnips will do well, and then our true yams do well. So we're making it very confusing here by growing these fake yams next to the true yams. But that's how we run this channel. We try to keep it as confusing as possible. You have to learn Latin, guys. It's the only way to know for sure. Sand by its very nature is low in nutrients, low in exchange capacity, and often minerals just pass directly through it, and it's hard to build up, you know, like a loam or a clay where you could build it up. So using compost teas and fertigating will often allow you to grow in even just pure sand. I have propagation beds in my greenhouse, and I just use a liquid nutrient solution. You can take some manure and mix it with water, or you can make a compost tea. You can put a bunch of stuff in a barrel and let it rot down. I call that Dave's fetid swamp water. Let it rot down, thin it out, and use it to water things with. So you're using the sand just as the medium to hold the roots. And I have propagation beds where I start cuttings and I start yams from pieces, and they're just sand. It's just pure construction sand. Literally, I had pure white sand dumped, and I filled a tire with it, and I filled some beds with it, and I stick cuttings in there, and I root things in it, and it's very easy to dig them out and put them into pots later because that sand is just sand. So you don't have to actually improve it, and sometimes it takes a huge amount of organic matter to improve it. If you wanted to garden in a larger space, just get a barrel, make yourself some compost tea, and feed it right along there. And over time, hopefully, you can improve it and do some sheet mulching and add, you know, nice mulches and really build it up into something pretty. But you don't even have to do that. You can garden in sand without it. So if I had to choose between thick pottery clay and pure beach sand, I would choose the pure beach sand. It's just easier to work with. You can really garden under almost any conditions, and you can feed your garden with less effort than you think. Sand, clay, silt, rocks, there are solutions for almost everything. And if you want to know how to feed your garden for free, check out my book, Compost Everything, The Good Guide to Extreme Composting, in which I use all kinds of simple methods to take materials that you already have and use them to feed your garden. That's Compost Everything, The Good Guide to Extreme Composting, and I'll put a link to that below. Also, if you like the Live, Laugh, Compost Your Enemies shirts, this is a newer design from my friends at Aardvark Screen Printing, who make these right here in Alabama. I will put a link to these shirts below. They're good conversation starters. They kind of bother the normies. Thanks for joining me. Catch you all next time. And until then, may your thumbs always be green. You ready?